May 26, 1868. The gavel fell on the impeachment of a sitting president, Andrew Johnson. Those who celebrated the end of the Civil War were in for a surprise. This was a continuation of the war in a sense, and the battles would be fought in courtrooms, not battlefields. The role of freed blacks, the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of government, and the future of a country were all in play. The lead lawyer for Johnson's defense team was a man from Ohio, Henry Stanbery, who had stepped down as Johnson's Attorney General to take this role. This is an introduction to that man, a man who was heavily involved with the emerging legal scene in Ohio and with early Reconstruction efforts, a man who remains a mystery to many, although some may recognize his name. Who was Henry Stanbery? Like many influential men and women of the 1800s, he was building a nation. There were no blueprints, very little infrastructure, and in many cases, no easy way forward. Instead, these people relied on hard work, intelligence, common sense, and a vision of what was needed. Also, like many of his time, Henry has been reduced to a historical footnote, the defender of President Johnson, Ohio's first Attorney General, or some guy that had a middle school named after him in some small town in Ohio. So, let's look at Mr. Stanbery, his life, his times, and his accomplishments. We'll look at his early years as a lawyer, then focus on his work in President Andrew Johnson's administration, both as Attorney General and then as lead of Johnson's defense team. Along the way, we'll meet other important people of Henry's time, and we'll explore a little of the time they lived in before looking at his later years. Hopefully by the end of this video, we'll begin to gain an understanding of the man. Henry Stanbery was born on February 20, 1803 in New York City to Jonas Stanbery, a wealthy physician and land speculator, and his second wife, Anne Lucy McCready. Henry was the second of 7 children from this marriage, and she also brought her daughter Eliza from her first marriage into their family. Jonas inherited much of his fortune from his father Recompense, a wealthy New Jersey innkeeper and merchant who traded with Europe. Recompense would buy land with the profits and soon became a significant landowner. Jonas's first marriage to Frances Winans, herself the daughter of a wealthy landowner, ended in divorce in 1791, but not before she bore him 6 children, including Henry's half-brother William. William would go on to become a noted lawyer from Licking County and ride the circuit or travel the rural countryside working his trade with other lawyers and judges, including Thomas Ewing and Charles Sherman. William was also a future congressman, perhaps best known now for pulling a pistol during an argument with then Tennessee Congressman Sam Houston, only to have the pistol misfire and as a result receive a beating from Houston with his cane. Jonas was involved with the Scioto Company, a land speculation group formed in 1802 by a group of men led by James Kilbourne, a Connecticut businessman with an interest in purchasing inexpensive and unsettled land in the West, which at the time included Ohio. Kilbourne purchased land along the Whetstone River, now the Olentangy, in what's now Worthington, Ohio, and a number of other Scioto Company families moved to the area. A library was one of the first amenities to be built in the new town, and Jonas made a generous gift of books to the library, so significant that this library was named the Stanbery Library. In 1814, Jonas finally moved to Ohio, and he, Henry, and the rest of the family settled in Zanesville. The following year, Henry entered Washington College, now Washington and Jefferson College, in Washington, Pennsylvania, about 100 miles away. While there, Henry was a member of the Union Literary Society, a prestigious group of young men focused on debate and declamation. Henry graduated with honors 4 years later at the age of 16 and moved back to Zanesville. There, he quickly took up the study of law in 1819 under Ebenezer Granger, with whom he studied until Granger's death in 1822, after which he continued to study with Charles Goddard, also of Zanesville. Both Granger and Goddard were successful lawyers at the time. Goddard would become a noted Ohio politician. Granger, Stanbery's first mentor, was also a noted early Ohio geologist and was the husband of Eliza Stanbery, Henry's stepsister. Henry made the best of his time learning the trade, but by law he would have to wait until he was 21 years old to take the Ohio legal bar exam. At the time, the Ohio bar exam was an oral one, in front of a panel of Ohio Supreme Court justices. Finally, in May 1824, in Gallipolis, Ohio, he was admitted by the Ohio Supreme Court, which was in session on the circuit there. The members of the court were Calvin Peace, the Chief Justice, and Justices Peter Hitchcock, Jacob Burnett, and Charles Sherman. Charles Sherman, the father of General William Tecumseh Sherman, had a knack for bringing people together, and Stanbery quickly became associated with Thomas Ewing, a neighbor of Charles Sherman in Lancaster, Ohio. That's where Henry would begin practicing law in partnership with Ewing. Now in Lancaster, Henry quickly settled in. In the early 19th century, Lancaster was at the center of the legal scene in Ohio. Charles Sherman, Thomas Ewing, Philemon Beecher, William Irvin, and others had established themselves as some of the brightest legal minds in the West. Possibly his first case in the law practice of Thomas Ewing was over the contested ownership of a cow. Winning the case, he charged his client $5, which was settled by note. The client would go on to pay Henry's landlord half the amount in oats, but the rest was never paid. Henry would later refer to this case as his first great cause, least understood, and he supposedly kept the note as a souvenir of his first case and legal victory. There's a story that's related by several 19th century sources that shows the state of the legal practice of the times. A man was accused of horse stealing and was brought to trial. Having no lawyer, Stanbery was assigned to defend him. There was no room available for the two to speak, so with the court's permission, Henry took his client outside to the back of the building. Henry asked the man if he stole the horse, and the man replied that he'd expected they'd prove it on him. Looking at the woods around 300 yards away, Henry asked the man how long he thought it would take for him to run to it. The man said he thought he could make it in a minute or so. "Try it," Stanbery said. After the defendant was out of sight for a few minutes, Henry returned to court by himself. "Where's your client?" he was asked. "I have cleared him," said Henry. Although likely grounds for disbarment today, this wasn't an isolated event. There are a number of contemporary accounts where even prominent lawyers, when faced with an unreasonable or harsh judge, would take matters into their own hands. Usually, though, the cases seem more along the lines of what we'd expect to see today. Stanbery's business ledger shows him to be very busy, taking on a variety of cases, many for the recently formed Lancaster Bank, a bank for which he later served on the board of directors. During this time, Henry seemed to be thriving personally. Lancaster in Henry's time was famous for fine and elaborate entertainments, according to 19th century local histories, and Henry was noted as being one of the socially prominent young men of the town. For example, Henry Clay, the Kentucky congressman, often traveled through Lancaster on his way to Washington, D.C. In August 1825, the town decided to hold a formal public dinner in his honor, sponsored and paid for by a number of leading local citizens, including young Henry Stanbery. Eventually, Henry's thoughts turned to a local woman, Frances Beecher. Frances was the daughter of Philemon and Susan Gillespie Beecher, and they would marry on April 29, 1829, with plans to start their family together. Frances's father, Philemon Beecher, a 5-term U.S. congressman, was considered the leading lawyer in Lancaster in the early 1800s. Henry and other young lawyers of the time, like Thomas Ewing, studied law with him and worked in his practice. The Gillespies were another important Lancaster family. Later that year, Henry left the law practice of Thomas Ewing and joined the practice of William Irvin. Irvin had just gone off to Washington, D.C. the previous March to start his first term as a U.S. congressman. Unfortunately, tragedy soon struck. In 1830, their first child, a daughter, was evidently stillborn, as the infant was not named. Frances and Henry would go on to have 5 more children together, but only 3 of them would reach adulthood. In September 1830, the Stanberys bought a lot along High Street near Thomas Ewing's mansion and began to build their own home. Completed around 1834-1835, this stately mansion would be home to the growing Stanbery family. The well-preserved home still stands today in Lancaster's historic Square 13. The Stanberys would need a nice big home as during the 1830s, 4 little Stanberys arrived in Lancaster: Philemon Beecher, Louisa, Henry Jr., and George. As the family grew, Henry was active in the community too. By the mid-1830s, Lancaster was known to have had a good public library, and Henry served on the board of directors at the time, along with such notable locals as Thomas Ewing, William Medill, and Philadelph Van Trump. Henry was also an early member of the St. John's Protestant Episcopal Church, organized in 1835. The members of this small congregation were able to fund and begin construction of a new church in 1846. The church, built by Daniel Sifford Sr., the man who built many of the well-preserved houses and churches still present in Lancaster, was completed in 1852. Henry built his reputation in the 1830s as one of the premier lawyers in Ohio. The rising star of the Lancaster bar, one 19th century local historian wrote. In May 1838, he partnered with Lancaster native Philadelph Van Trump in a new law practice. Van Trump, a future U.S. congressman, was also Henry's brother-in-law, having married Maria Louisa Beecher, the sister of Mrs. Henry Stanbery. As the 1830s ended, 1840 got off to a very cold start for Henry. On January 28th, his wife Frances died, presumably while giving birth to a daughter, Frances Elizabeth, who also did not survive the day. Today, Frances Stanbery rests in Lancaster's Elmwood Cemetery, next to Frances Elizabeth and little infant Stanbery. Then, not even a month later on February 23rd, his father Jonas passed away in Zanesville. Henry soldiered on, running his practice and staying involved with the town. Little did he know then, but big changes were on the horizon. He soon met another woman who caught his eye, Cecilia Bond, the daughter of 3-term U.S. Representative William Key Bond from Chillicothe, Ohio. At 21 years old, she was 17 years younger than 38-year-old Henry. After a brief romance, they married on July 14, 1841 in Cincinnati. They had no children together, but one assumes that the 4 children from Henry's first marriage kept them very busy. In April 1843, Henry sold his house on High Street, and by 1846, he and his family had moved to Columbus. He was soon to enter the world of government. Now, having moved to the Columbus, Ohio area, Henry got to work. The question is, where did he move to? Unlike in Lancaster, where his home still stands, we don't really know. The first deed recorded in Franklin County for Henry was in 1835, showing that he paid his father $950 for 318 acres in what is now Truro Township. The property lies in the refugee tract, an area of over 100,000 acres in central Ohio which was set aside for citizens of British-controlled Canada who supported the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. The plot appears to be originally owned by Francis Cazot, a wealthy fur trader from Quebec who helped supply the Continental Army. An 1872 map shows the lot with what looks like a building in the center and possibly a road easement leading up to it. At the time, the area would have been very rural, so the building could have been a weekend estate or a farm. It's unlikely that Stanbery made his primary residence there. The same map shows that Henry owned a large plot of land just west of the area, maybe for investment purposes. Henry also owned several lots in downtown Columbus. He purchased his first in August of 1846, lot 445, for $400. This is located at the corner of Broad and 3rd Streets across from the current State House. We don't know how he used the property, but we can assume that it's worth considerably more than $400 today. He also owned at least 2 more lots near the center of the city, lots 479 and 481, which were purchased from his father-in-law, William Key Bond, for the princely sum of $1. Henry passed down much of his property in Truro Township to his heirs. In 1923, The family sold a large area of land there to Charles F. Johnson, a real estate developer, for $1. Johnson used a portion of this land for an equestrian community, with the historic Eastmoor Polo Club at its heart. In February 1846, the state legislature created the role of Attorney General, and Stanbery was selected by the General Assembly to fill the position. For his yearly salary of $750 and a cut of the money he collected, Henry would be required to act as legal advisor, prepare contracts, give legal opinions, keep records and report, and represent the interests of the state, which sounds just a little broad. Later, he was also given the authority to negotiate deals with long-term debtors to the state. Henry's first year was mostly spent organizing the new office. He developed a tracking system for cases, and he put in place a standardized crime report system for county prosecutors. Stanbery gave his first report to the General Assembly in December of 1847, stating that he had collected over $3,000 owed to the state and won judgments for another $2,850, but that he was having a hard time compiling crime reports due to county prosecutors not providing him with their reports. In 1849, the Attorney General's position became an elected one, and when his term expired in April 1851, Henry didn't seek re-election. Stanbery also served as representative for Franklin County at Ohio's Second Constitutional Convention in 1850. The state's population was approaching 2 million people, and the first Constitution, written in 1802, was no longer adequate. The convention began in May 1850, and 108 delegates from across Ohio attended the convention. These men came from a wide range of professions: lawyers, farmers, physicians, and tradesmen. Quite a mix, and as the historian C.B. Galbraith would write in 1911, some of the delegates would probably not have recognized a state constitution had it come walking up the principal street of the capital city. Indeed, many delegates seldom, if ever, contributed to the debates. Fortunately, the delegates also included some of the best legal minds in Ohio. The president of the convention was William Medill, an associate of Stanbery's in Lancaster and a future state governor. Henry quickly rose to a leadership position in the group, along with men such as Medill and William Grosbeck, a noted lawyer and later a defender of Andrew Johnson at his impeachment. Stanbery's contributions were noted at the time, both by his peers and by historians. One account later states that he gave Columbus fitting eminence in the convention. Despite a cholera outbreak in July 1850, the convention reconvened in Cincinnati in December. The new Constitution was completed in March 1851 and was ratified by Ohio voters that June. Henry continued to be involved in the community and with his business ventures. He served on the board of directors of Capital University in Bexley from 1850 to 1851, where his son Henry Jr. was in his freshman year. Henry served as a director for the City Bank of Columbus, and he was also interested in the newly built roads and turnpikes in the area. He was also a director for both the Columbus and Sunbury Turnpike Company and the Columbus and Granville Plank Road, which both became active in 1852. Once again, though, tragedy struck. On November 8, 1852, his son Henry Jr. died. The cause of death is not known, and he was buried in Franklin County. He was later reinterred and reburied in Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati in August 1860. Henry Jr. now lies by his father and his stepmother Cecilia. By 1853, Cincinnati had a population of over 115,000 people and would be a great place for Stanbery's legal practice. There was a storm gathering, though, that would erupt in a few years, the American Civil War, and in the aftermath, Henry's life would change significantly. So, let's shift our focus towards his legal practice and his actions in a country at war with itself. Henry's practice was in high demand, even arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court, and he needed talented lawyers working with him. Stanbery seemed good at developing intelligent young people, and he didn't forget his roots. As one example, he trained Lancaster, Ohio native John Noble. Noble was born in 1831, so he would have been about the same age as Stanbery's son Philemon Beecher, and one might be excused for imagining the two children as playmates. Mr. Noble would later become a lawyer and Secretary of the Interior under President Benjamin Harrison. He also trained Thomas Ewing, Jr., the future Civil War general and U.S. Congressman and the son of Thomas and Maria Ewing. Henry would sponsor him for membership in the Ohio Bar in 1855, and Thomas Jr. would briefly practice law in Cincinnati before moving to Lawrence, Kansas in 1856. Let's look at some of the cases Stanbery worked during this time, like the United States v. the City Bank of Columbus, a case argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. It involved a cashier appointing someone to transfer funds between two U.S. Treasury banks without the board of directors' approval, money which never made it to the second bank. Stanbery argued that Citibank wasn't liable for the actions of its cashier and was not responsible for the money gone missing. The Supreme Court agreed. A technical case and sometimes cited in later cases, but recall that Henry was one of the directors of this bank during its time in Columbus. Or how about a case that reads like a current-day true crime novel, and one that pitted Stanbery against his friend Thomas Ewing? In the morning of January 14, 1852, the steamer Martha Washington, on her way from Cincinnati to New Orleans, caught fire under suspicious circumstances on the Mississippi River. The very heavily loaded steamer and its cargo were destroyed within 3 minutes, according to accounts, and as many as 10 people died in the fire, including an entire family. Several men, including one William Cassane, a shady character who would later be found guilty of insurance fraud to pay his legal bills, were brought to trial, largely on the basis of a deathbed confession by a man who would also have stood to have been implicated. The best legal talent at the time participated, and over 400 witnesses were called. Jury members reported being threatened by defendants' families. Newspapers had a field day, and the trial lasted until November 1853. Stanbery, representing the prosecution, presented a passionate and well-prepared argument urging for justice to be served. You can imagine his surprise when Ewing, on behalf of the defendants, submitted his case without argument. He was probably even more surprised when Ewing won the case. Not content to go their own ways, the defendants sought revenge. Stanbery's safe was blown up, and all his papers related to the case went missing. 9 witnesses died violently, and the man who originally brought the case had his house blown up. The government wasn't content to rest either, and he brought even more cases against the defendants. Cassane fled to Latin America and finally to San Francisco, where he continued his misadventures and left a trail of victims resulting from his scams. He was finally brought to justice in 1887 in California, and in his old age spent quality time in a notorious Sing Sing prison in New York. Stanbery and Ewing would be opponents again that year when they argued a case over the ownership of the Ohio business interests of the Methodist Church, which is split into Northern, abolitionist, and Southern, slavery-supporting branches. Ewing, representing the Northern branch, won the case, but in hindsight, the case portended more trouble to come. In 1857, the Stanberys moved across the Ohio River to Campbell County, Kentucky, where they established an elegant hilltop mansion. Henry would live out his life there, and we'll revisit it later. With the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1861, that gathering storm erupted when Confederate forces shelled Fort Sumter. Of course, lawsuits kept coming, and the lawyers still kept busy, but with the war and an upcoming presidential election in 1864, other matters started to occupy Stanbery's time. Things like an 1863 request from a Union soldier stationed in Tennessee asking Stanbery for his help in gaining a leadership role for a regiment of black soldiers led by white officers. Requests to speak, all for the same week in October 1864, in Zanesville, Cleveland, and Frankfort, Kentucky. He chose Frankfort, by the way. And an 1864 request from a professor in Danville, Kentucky, for copies of a speech that Henry recently had given in Newport, Kentucky, for circulation at the school. Why this sudden interest in having Henry as a speaker? The answer might have to do with that Newport speech, one that was widely published in newspapers of the day. The Ballot and the Bullet, How to Save the Nation. Here, Stanbery jumped into the debate around the 1864 election with both feet. In this speech, he offers an unrelenting argument in support of the Lincoln and Andrew Johnson ticket. Stanbery starts by noting that Lincoln had won him over by his actions in trying to preserve the Union. Next, he establishes the link between the election and the war and poses the rhetorical question, who would the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, vote for? He then proceeds to argue for the Lincoln-Johnson ticket while dismantling McClellan and Pendleton, their opponents. Conversational, logical, and comprehensive, he ends with the point that with victory in sight, now's not the time for a change, especially given the nature of the opposing candidates. An accessible yet powerful speech. Let's now take a brief look at the 1864 election and Andrew Johnson's involvement in particular, since it'll have a big impact on Stanbery and the nation. By mid-1864, the nation was sick of the war, and the Republicans and Lincoln knew it. Lincoln also knew there was a good chance he'd lose the election to the general he had fired 2 years before, George McClellan. The Republicans, now renamed the Union Party in part to attract Union Democrats, held their nominating convention on June 7th and 8th of 1864. The push to attract these Democrats also led the Union Party to drop then Vice President Hannibal Hamlin in favor of Andrew Johnson, a Union Democrat from Tennessee. The Democrat Party was divided between war Democrats like George McClellan, who supported military efforts but not abolition, and peace Democrats or Copperheads, who opposed the war and wanted an immediate settlement. McClellan's running mate was George Pendleton, a congressman from Ohio and a Copperhead. The Democrats' focus was to capitalize on the public's disillusionment with the war. Let's take a quick look at Andrew Johnson. Johnson was born in a shack in Raleigh, North Carolina in late December 1808. His parents were illiterate tavern workers, and in early 1812, his father died saving 2 wealthy townsmen from an icy stream. His reward was to be buried in an unmarked grave in a local potter's field. Andrew became apprenticed to a tailor where he learned the trade, and in late summer of 1826, he loaded his mother, stepfather, and all of their possessions into a 2-wheel cart pulled by a blind horse and traveled to eastern Tennessee, where he opened a tailor shop in Greenville in March 1827. 2 months later, he married 17-year-old Eliza McCardle, who with only an elementary school education, taught Andrew to write and to do basic math. He then joined a debate society and walked 4 miles every Friday night to attend before walking back home. This piqued his interest in politics, and in 1829 he became town alderman and 2 years later mayor. His political ambitions grew, and ultimately he was elected to the Tennessee State Legislature, served 5 consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, served as governor of Tennessee, and as a U.S. Senator. At the time, he was characterized as stubborn, combative, and a demagogue, usually by wealthy Southerners and often by his own Democrat Party, which consisted mostly of upper-class lawyers and planners who made it clear they'd have nothing to do with him if he weren't so popular with the masses. In return, Johnson hated them. Andrew appealed to the plebeians, small farmers and self-employed tradesmen, and he considered the wealthy as parasites. The poor trusted him to look out for them. Importantly, Andrew Johnson relied on his own trusted political machine. "I am no party man, bound by no party platform, and I will vote as I please," he said. He was one tough tailor. At the time, stump speaking, debates between rival candidates or between a candidate and a hostile crowd, could determine the outcome of an election. He was, according to one biographer, the best stumper in the state and maybe the nation. And he had extraordinary stamina and courage. A reporter wrote in 1853, "He looked as rarely as ever a man looked, slowly turning his deep, dark, Webster-like orbs to various parts of the crowd, which seemed scarcely to breathe. In debates, he cut and slashed right and left, running his opponents through and through with a rusty, jagged weapon." Johnson absolutely opposed secession as treason, believed in states' rights, and defended the right of slavery, but he argued that slavery could be best protected inside the Union, and that the Union must be preserved at all costs. Later, he would go on to support emancipation, not out of concern for blacks, but as a way of winning the war and breaking the backs of the Southern aristocrats. "Damn the Negroes," he told Union General John Palmer. "I am fighting those traitorous aristocrats, their masters." Johnson was the only senator from a rebel state to stay in Congress, and he became the symbol of Southern Unionism. His pro-Union speeches were widely publicized in the North. He won widespread acclaim there, and the New York Times even called him the greatest man of the age. After Grant drove the Confederates out of Middle and Western Tennessee, Lincoln sent Johnson to Nashville as military governor. He established a pro-Union civil government there, some said by the use of questionable tactics, which he justified as necessary to restore the state to the Union. Given his performance as military governor and his appeal to pro-war Northern Democrats and border state Unionists, Lincoln thought he would make a good choice. The tide of the war soon changed. Lincoln was re-elected president in 1865, and Johnson's vice presidency got off to a very rocky start. Johnson arrived in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration in late February 1865, very weak from a severe fight with typhoid fever. On the night before the inauguration, he drank a lot of wine and awoke on March 4th with a hangover. Arriving at the Capitol in the morning, he stopped by outgoing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin's office and asked Hamlin for some good whiskey, saying, "I need all the strength for the occasion I can have." He gulped down 2 or 3 tumblers of it before heading to the Senate chamber for his inauguration. Obviously, alcohol, dehydration, fatigue, and typhoid fever isn't a great combination. The Senate chamber was stifling hot, and Johnson's condition quickly worsened. His vice presidential acceptance speech was a slurred, rambling mess, and his supporters, including Lincoln, were humiliated. Democrats, who considered him a traitor, called for his resignation. Lincoln, though, was forgiving. He told a concerned cabinet member, "I've known Andy for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard." In fact, as Lincoln was vetting Johnson before the Republican convention in 1864, he had an agent investigate Andrew's habits. The agent said that although Johnson liked whiskey, he rarely overindulged, unlike many politicians of the era. Realizing he'd humiliated himself, Johnson retired to the home of Francis Preston Blair in Silver Springs, Maryland for 2 weeks to recover, mentally and physically. He returned to Washington, and on April 14th met with Lincoln for the first time since the inauguration. That night came an urgent knock on his hotel room door. Lincoln had been shot. Andrew Johnson would be president, and soon Henry Stanbery would be his attorney general. After Lincoln's death on the morning of April 15, 1865, Johnson was sworn in as president a few hours later in what newspapers described as a solemn and dignified ceremony. With the end of the Civil War in sight, Reconstruction, or rebuilding the country, began in earnest. Let's approach this large and complex topic by focusing on a few major areas where Stanbery was most involved. Lincoln had wanted to bring the rebel states back into the Union quickly. One example being his proposed 10% plan, which required only 10% of a state's voting-age population to take a loyalty oath to rejoin the Union. His actions were increasingly at odds with the emerging radical Republican faction in Congress. They wanted immediate suffrage for the blacks and punishment for the rebel states. Johnson shared Lincoln's vision of a speedy reunion, but early actions like his veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and his veto of the bill rechartering the Freedmen's Bureau, both later overridden, broadened the rift between Johnson and Congress. They also didn't sit well with his Attorney General, James Speed, who he had inherited from Lincoln and who had become increasingly radicalized. By 1866, Stanbery was becoming more involved with the Johnson administration. In March, he helped Speed argue Ex parte Milligan before the Supreme Court. The administration lost this landmark case when the court held that military tribunals for civilian defendants were illegal in places where the civilian criminal justice system was working. In April 1866, President Johnson nominated Stanbery to the Supreme Court to replace Associate Justice John Catron, who had just died. The Republican-led Congress, now at odds with Johnson at nearly every turn, reduced the size of the Supreme Court that July, and so Stanbery was denied the role. That same month, Attorney General James Speed resigned, and Stanbery was selected to replace him. Approved by the Senate this time, he immediately got to work. For example, in the 1867 case Mississippi v. Johnson, the state of Mississippi tried to sue President Johnson for enforcing the Reconstruction Acts. Stanbery successfully argued that separation of powers prevented the Supreme Court from issuing an injunction against the president when he used executive action to implement Reconstruction policies. Reconstruction was between the president and Congress, not the courts. After a resounding victory in the 1866 congressional elections, the radical Republicans began dismantling Johnson's Reconstruction efforts in earnest. Central to their approach was the Military Reconstruction Acts, 4 laws passed by Congress over Johnson's vetoes giving the conditions for Southern states to be readmitted to the Union. The first Reconstruction Act divided the 10 remaining rebellious states into 5 military districts, each administered by a military governor. New state constitutions were needed that included voting privileges for all males, white or black. The states also had to pass the 14th Amendment, which granted civil rights to all blacks. The remaining 3 acts addressed issues with the first. Stanbery's opinions take a narrow interpretation of the first 3 acts and were consistent with Johnson's approach. Johnson vetoed all 4 acts, and his first veto provided the guidelines for the others. Stanbery argues that the states already have governments that can provide order. A military dictatorship isn't needed. The acts are designed to coerce the people of the South into accepting views that they may not hold to. Finally, the military commanders, or monarchs, as Johnson called them, had too much discretion outside of the Constitution. After the second act was passed, Stanbery ruled that the provisions revoking individuals' right to vote were too broad. Congress then passed the third act, which ran directly counter to Stanbery's objections. Johnson just pocket vetoed the fourth act, and Congress promptly overrode him. Even though Johnson opposed these acts, he worked with Stanton and Grant to appoint generals to administer the districts. Stanton and these generals would cause issues for Johnson, and his responses to them would soon lead to impeachment. The reason President Johnson was impeached is usually summed up by saying he violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Let's look deeper, again focusing on Stanbery's involvement when possible. First, meet Edwin Stanton, an Ohio-born lawyer and politician who was appointed by Lincoln as his Secretary of War. His peers and historians have described him as driven, brilliant, and hard-nosed, but also scheming, mean, and backstabbing. Gideon Welles, Lincoln and Johnson's Secretary of the Navy, despised Stanton, a fellow cabinet member. Welles considered Stanton treacherous, vindictive, and wicked, and a spy for the radical Republicans. Stanbery would often find himself at odds with Stanton, especially around Henry's legal opinions on the Reconstruction Acts. Stanton constantly undermined Johnson, and this worsened over time. An example occurred in the time leading up to Stanton's first dismissal and involved Johnson's conflicts with Stanton, Grant, and General Philip Sheridan. At Stanton's urging, Johnson appointed Sheridan military governor over the Louisiana and Texas District, one of 5 established by the first Reconstruction Act. Soon after, Sheridan started dismissing senior civil officials. When Johnson ordered that no more removals be made until Stanbery ruled on the matter, Sheridan was told by Grant to ignore him, telling him that Congress wanted the district commanders to interpret the law themselves. He also told Sheridan that both he and Stanton wouldn't allow him to lose his command. After the second Reconstruction Act passed, the military commanders asked Stanbery to clarify who was eligible to take an oath stating they hadn't rebelled against the United States and so could vote. While Stanbery pondered, Sheridan began disenfranchising nearly every state official there was. As Sheridan said, the Attorney General should not hamper me too much, since he was so far away in Washington. Grant agreed. When Stanbery gave his opinion narrowing who could not take the oath, All district commanders complied except Sheridan. Grant told Sheridan to ignore it and to continue to interpret the law as he saw fit. After disregarding the president's direction several more times, Johnson replaced Sheridan on August 17, 1867. 5 days earlier, Johnson had asked Stanton to resign, and he replaced him with Grant as interim war secretary. Grant reluctantly agreed, but insisted that the Senate authorize his appointment according to the Tenure of Office Act. On January 13, 1868, Congress refused, so Stanton reassumed the role. The Tenure of Office Act, enacted in March 1867, required the President to obtain the approval of the Senate before dismissing any official they had ratified. Most in Johnson's cabinet felt that it was an attempt by the Radicals to protect Stanton, their inside man, and a trap. When Congress was considering the act, the question of its constitutionality came up at a cabinet meeting, and Gideon Welles noted that Stanbery required no time to express his unqualified condemnation of it. Johnson vetoed the bill, and Congress overrode him. Stanbery advised Johnson not to remove Stanton from office, but Johnson did it anyway. On February 21, 1868, he fired Stanton again, replacing him with General Lorenzo Thomas. This might have been a jab at Stanton, who once said that he would like to pick Lorenzo Thomas up with a pair of tongs and drop him from the nearest window. Stanton, naturally, refused to accept his firing, barricaded himself in his War Department office where he stayed until Johnson's impeachment trial was over, and had Thomas arrested. Congress responded quickly. They introduced a resolution to impeach Johnson that same day. The Reconstruction Committee passed it the next, as did the House on February 24th. A week later, the House adopted 11 articles of impeachment and sent these to the Senate. The first 9 addressed Johnson's replacement of Stanton with Thomas. The 11th was a combination of these articles, but the 10th, added by Representative Benjamin Butler, charged Johnson with the intent to disgrace Congress with a loud voice, certain intemperate, inflammatory, and scandalous harangues. The House managers or prosecutors were all congressmen, and Thaddeus Stevens was the driving force behind the impeachment. Stevens was an absolute supporter of rights for blacks and a true believer that the South should be punished for their sin of rebellion. He was relentless in pursuing his goals, and at the time of the impeachment, he was dying. Introducing the resolution to impeach to the House, he had to be carried to the door of the chamber by his aides. His diet at the time was said to be a mixture of raw eggs, brandy, opium, and terrapin. Mark Twain, who attended the impeachment, wrote, "The haggard, cadaverous old man dragged himself to his place and sat down. There was a soul in his sunken eyes, but otherwise he was a corpse that was ready for the shroud." With Stevens ill, it fell on his team to deliver the prosecution's arguments. They'd be up against a defense team consisting of all-star level lawyers and judges, and were led by Stanbery, who had resigned as Attorney General to devote himself to Johnson's defense. Johnson didn't attend a trial based on Stanbery's advice. He listened this time. Butler delivered the opening comments for the prosecution and gave a fiery speech that confused many with its referrals back to Cromwell, English custom, and Napoleonic-era French precedents. Curtis's speech on behalf of the defense was a focused, logical legal attack on the articles, very reflective of Stanbery's involvement. This set the tone for the trial. The major points of the defense argument that Stanbery and his team crafted were that Johnson didn't violate the Tenure of Office Act since Stanton was appointed by Lincoln, couldn't be impeached over a vague law, wanted to test the constitutionality of the act, was just trying to keep the War Department running by appointing Thomas, and the president has a right to free speech. The prosecution argued that the president had clearly violated the Tenure of Office Act, and that it's the president's duty to execute a law passed by Congress, whether he thinks it's constitutional or not. They also objected constantly to the defense asking to call witnesses or present evidence. These were usually upheld, even when Supreme Court Chief Justice Solomon Chase, the presiding judge, allowed their admission. The Senate simply overrode him. Demand for spectator seats was so high that a lottery was held to distribute the 100 tickets for each day's event. As the proceedings dragged on, the trial took its toll on the participants. Stevens usually couldn't participate, and on April 14th, Henry also fell sick with pleurisy, a serious lung infection, and became bedridden. He continued to work, passing his opinions and ideas along to his team. By early May, Stanbery had recovered enough to deliver his closing argument. He recapped the defense that the team had presented, but he also slammed Butler's article accusing the president of slandering Congress, and finished with an impassioned personal defense of Johnson. On May 16th, the Senate voted on the 11th article of impeachment. The vote was 32 for and 21 against, one vote short of the two-thirds majority needed to impeach. The Senate then adjourned until the 26th, and the 10 Republicans who had joined the Democrats faced extreme pressure to change their vote. A furious Wells wrote, after lamenting the fact that they wouldn't delay a day to accommodate the ailing Stanbery, "If by any trick or subterfuge they can succeed, the radicals will resort to it, however unprincipled." Much of the pressure was directed towards Senator Edmund Ross, who had pledged to convict Johnson before changing his mind. Threatened with a bribery investigation by fellow Kansas Senator Samuel Pomeroy, and told he would be shot if he ever returned to Kansas, John F. Kennedy would later write about Ross in his book, Profiles in Courage. On May 26th, the Senate voted on the second and third articles of impeachment. Again, Ross voted against them, and again the Senate fell one vote short. Having had enough, the Senate ended the trial without voting on the remaining 8 articles. Johnson would remain president, and there would be consequences for Stanbery. The day after the impeachment trial ended, Johnson renominated Stanbery, now unemployed, to Attorney General. He was rejected by the Senate in a rebuke to Johnson. Henry was replaced by William Everetts, also a member of Johnson's defense team. Stanbery returned to his home in Campbell County, Kentucky, and wouldn't hold public office again. He would serve as the president of the Cincinnati Bar Association from 1873 to 1876, and would sometimes give speeches and write about politics. His focus now was on his business interests and his law practice. A delegate to the Cincinnati Southern Railroad Convention in 1870, he argued a case on their behalf to the Ohio Supreme Court in 1872. The ruling allowed a railroad built by the city of Cincinnati to operate, in spite of the 1851 Constitution prohibiting municipalities from owning such things. His most important case of the time involved the Ku Klux Klan. KKK activity increased in South Carolina after the 1870 state election. Unspeakable violence against blacks and Union supporters was happening nightly, so President Grant sent federal troops to the state. Mass arrests occurred, and the most prominent Klansmen went to trial. In the most important case, the prosecution for the federal government could have easily convicted several Klansmen based on the newly passed Enforcement Acts. These provided for federal criminal charges against violations of the rights of blacks granted by the 14th and 15th Amendments. Their goal was bigger, though, so South Carolina Democrats raised over $10,000 to enlist the services of Stanbery and Reverdy Johnson, supposedly the highest-paid American lawyer at the time. The prosecution's goal was to nationalize black rights by extending the meaning of the Reconstruction Amendments and extending protection of the Enforcement Acts to also include the Second and Fourth Amendments. This was an unprecedented expansion of federal power. Stanbery and Johnson seized on the constitutional issues at hand and left the local attorneys to handle the defendants. They were incidental to both sides anyway. The defense's approach was to interpret the constitutional questions conservatively, based on a states' rights approach. They also avoided any arguments that legitimized the KKK's actions and denounced the Klan in open court. Several defendants were convicted of conspiracy, but the judges refused to rule on the counts combining the Second, Fourth, and 14th Amendment rights. The prosecution appealed the case to the Supreme Court, but with no precedent set, their case failed. Johnson and Stanbery lost the battle but won the war. Klan members went to jail, but federal expansion was denied. Klan activity then dropped considerably, but violence by whites against blacks in the South continued. After 1878, Henry turned his attention to his estate in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, a town he drafted the Articles of Incorporation for in 1866 and spent more time investing in real estate. On March 27, 1880, he paid taxes on $175,000 worth of real estate, the most in Campbell County. During this time, he was also an active member of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in nearby Newport, Kentucky. In his last years, we see a different side of Henry, his love of his family. In a note to his son Philemon, Henry concludes with, "We unite in love to dear Maggie and the dear children, and with kind regards to Mr. and Mrs. Hart, your affectionate father." In the postscript, Mom also chimed in. "Your dear mother asked me to caution you against using your voice too frequently in stump speaking, and to be careful to avoid drafts of cold air and exposure when you have made a speech." Around June 1880, he traveled to New York for cataract surgery. The cataracts were removed, but by the beginning of 1881, he was totally blind. In a letter to his daughter Louisa in November 1880, Henry wrote, "My dear Louisa, thankful and happy beyond expression, I can at last realize my escape out of darkness into light. Now I can, with the blind poet, hail it as holy, firstborn of creation, if not of the divine essence." This letter should have been an acknowledgment of dear Franks of the Fourth, but my pen, like the harp of an Acheron, would only respond to one dear name, my beloved Louisa. Concluding with, "I must stop, but not without our united love to our dear ones at their distant home. As ever, your loving father." On Monday, June 20th, 1881, Henry developed acute bronchitis while riding in New York's Central Park. He died that following Saturday night, June 25th. Henry's last words were said to have been, "I have been neither saint nor savage, but I have tried to do my best." Now that we've seen Henry's life, how can we describe him? Well, he was a builder of the Ohio Attorney General's office and the 1851 Constitution for starters. He was a lawyer. Henry's arguments and legal opinions are still cited. One example, Colorado's recent attempt to keep President Trump off the 2024 presidential ballot used parts of his opinion about the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment. He was a defender of Johnson, but most importantly the Constitution. Johnson's impeachment was really a political battle to determine which branch of government was supreme. Contrast Johnson's ignore Congress approach with Thaddeus Stevens' belief that Congress is the only sovereign body in the United States government. Stanbery's strict conservative approach to this trial and others made those involved consider the Constitution as a whole and the ramifications of their political aims. How about as a person? Gideon Welles shared a good relationship with Stanbery. He considered him an excellent lawyer but too tactful and sensitive, as well as being guilty of taking a lawyer's view of questions rather than a politician's. He also worried that he was too timid to stand up to bullies like Stevens and Butler during the impeachment trial. Walt Whitman, American poet and Civil War nurse, began work in the Attorney General's office in 1865. He wrote, "I was the Attorney General's clerk there and did a good deal of writing. He seemed to like my opinions, judgment, so a good part of my work was to spare him work, to go over the correspondence, give him the juice, substance of affairs, avoiding all else." Stanbery was the man, and a real noble fellow he was too, Western, not graceful in carriage but with a fine face, a Lincolnish sort of man, although not Lincoln by any manner of means. He had much to do in the Johnson trial, and the bigwigs valued his counsel highly. A quiet, unobtrusive, but ready man, good at rebuttal, re-rebuttal, almost loggish in some of his ways. To his fellow lawyers and historians of his time, Henry was special, and they didn't hold back in their praise, highlighting his legal ability, honor, integrity, and kindness. Today, he seems to be either lumped in with Andrew Johnson and dismissed, or at best, given a cursory look. History is more complex, and maybe this brief introduction will give you the background and hopefully interest to reach your own understanding of the man. Before his story, like the story of many others of his era, is lost to time.